Hey everyone, welcome back to Theodicies Apologetics. So glad you're joining us today. Today I'm joined by Dr. Max Baker-Hytch. He's a philosopher in the United Kingdom. He's authored many different papers, and he's the co-author of a paper on the Evil God Challenge. So Max, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Zach.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, just kind of looking at the Evil God Challenge and some of the proposed symmetries and asymmetries, kind of looking at this. So to start off, could you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. So yeah, I guess I'm a philosopher. I teach philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, which is part of Oxford University. I also work with the OCCA, which is the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. So I kind of inhabit two worlds. So I'm a professional academic, and I also do some apologetics. Yeah, I did my PhD at Oxford in philosophy of religion with Brian Leftow. And yeah, I did that looking at kind of the epistemology of Alvin Plantinga. Yeah, so I'm really interested in philosophy of religion, epistemology, also really interested in New Testament studies and historical Jesus.
That's awesome. So today we're going to be taking a look at the Evil God Challenge and there's symmetries and kind of how.
Sorry, Zach, I missed that. Your connection dropped out a little bit.
My apologies. I will work on that. But basically, I was just asking you, what is the Evil God Challenge?
Yeah, right. So the Evil God Challenge is a kind of parody argument against theism. So, in general, a parody argument is where you say, well, this concept or argument is like this concept or argument. So A is like B, and B is just obviously ridiculous, and therefore A is also just as ridiculous, right? So that's a sort of familiar type of argument. And so the Evil God Challenge is really trying to say, well, look, the good God hypothesis, which lots of people believe in, has all these symmetries, or these ways in which it is similar to the hypothesis of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-evil being, which is a concept that hardly anyone believes in. But the idea is, well, look, everyone thinks that, most people think that an evil God is ridiculous, but given these symmetries, then we should actually think that the good God is just as ridiculous.
So in the paper, you talk about these three kinds of symmetries that will be used by evil God proponents. Do you want to kind of just talk about those three and what's going on?
Yeah, sure. Well, so I mean, this isn't people who actually promote the Evil God Challenge don't generally frame it in quite this way, but I think they need the proponents of the Evil God Challenge need to, if their challenge is going to work, they need to show that the evil God is symmetrical to the good God in the following three ways. So the one that they talk the most about is with respect to the problem of evil. So proponents of the Evil God Challenge will argue that so just as there's a problem of evil for theism, how is it that a good God could allow so much evil and suffering? And theists will try to defend theism by appealing to what are called Theodicies, which are basically stories that try to try to kind of give plausible reasons God might have for allowing evil for the sake of some greater goods, right? And so what Evil God or proponents of the Evil God Challenge will say is, well, the hypothesis of an all evil God faces the problem of good. Why would an all evil being allow there to be so much goodness in the world? And they point out that you can kind of take some of the, or even most of the theodicies that theists offer, and you can basically reverse them so that instead of saying, well, a good God would allow evil because it sort of allows human character to be built. So it's a sort of soul-making theodicy. trials and tribulations allow for courage and maturity to be formed in a person. Well, the evil God hypothesis might be defended against the problem of good by saying that, well, the reason that an evil God allows goodness in the world is to allow people to become kind of decadent, and he allows good things so that people can overindulge and become greedy and kind of corrupt their characters. So a sort of soul corruption, reverse theodicy. So anyway, all that to say, proponents of the evil God challenge want to say that there's a more or less perfect symmetry between the two. In terms of the problem of good is a really big problem for the evil God hypothesis. The problem of evil is a really big problem for the good God hypothesis. Both try to defend themselves with Theodicies, attempted explanations that try to reconcile the evil God or the good God with the presence of so much good or so much evil. And they claim that you can more or less do this equally well in either direction. Now, as I said, that tends to be what most of the discussion centers around in the literature. But there are two other symmetries that evil God challenges. Now, sorry, I keep using this phrase, proponents of the evil God challenge or evil God challengers. Just to be clear, these are not people who believe in the evil God hypothesis. These are people who claim that the evil God and good God are symmetrical, right? And generally they're atheists. So yeah, evil God challengers need to maintain two other symmetries. So we've talked about the problem of good and problem of evil, but they also need to maintain symmetry with respect to the evidence which there might be for the good God hypothesis or the evil God hypothesis. They need to claim that the evidence that's out there supports these two hypotheses roughly equally. It doesn't support one of them more than the other. And we might call that natural theology symmetry. And natural theology being the endeavor of kind of arguing from evidence in the natural world to the existence of God. And then finally, and this is the one that's least discussed, and indeed some evil God challengers kind of try to get around it, having to take it into account at all, which we could talk about in a minute, is what we might call intrinsic coherence symmetry. So even if the problem of good and the problem of evil are as big problems for those two hypotheses, and even if the evidence out there in the world equally supports the two hypotheses, they could still be asymmetrical because one of them is just incoherent. Intrinsically, the concept is incoherent, whereas in the case of the other one, the concept is coherent. So that's what we can call intrinsic coherence symmetry. Is it like equally plausible that the concept just in and of itself is logically coherent? And so yeah, as I said, the evil God challenger, if they want to claim that the ridiculousness of the evil God hypothesis, the implausibility of it transfers over to the good God hypothesis, they have to say that in all of those three respects, they're basically on a par.
Yeah, that's great. And hopefully I think you can hear me good because my connection, I apologize if I phase out of something. I checked my internet before this and I was like, oh, it's gonna be great. And now it's iffy, but we'll see how it goes. But with the intrinsic coherence symmetry or asymmetry, where maybe an evil God challenge want to say we could have an omnipotent, omniscient, malevolent being, an all evil being. Let's talk about some of the proposed asymmetries that you have, and one of them is the bracketing move. Can you talk about what you think it is and why you believe it fails for evil God proponents? Right.
So this is a move that two philosophers who proposed the evil God challenge tried to make this move, which is, and the point of the move is to try and say we don't have to worry about intrinsic coherence. It doesn't matter if the evil God is an incoherent concept. So it's Stephen Law and Asher Lancaster Thomas who both try to make this move, and the move is basically to say, well, it's because the move is basically to say, look, even when you put aside all considerations to do with intrinsic symmetry, intrinsic coherence, theists would still believe in the good God, even if it were the case that so actually, no, that's not the best way to put it. I think the best way to put it is this: the bracketing move basically says that the reason theists reject the evil God is not really because of intrinsic coherence. It's really because of the problem of good, right? And if that's the real reason, then even if you took away the stuff about intrinsic incoherence, they would still reject the evil God hypothesis, because their real reason for rejecting it is there's too much goodness in the world. And if that's correct, then what the evil God challenger can say is, well, okay, then given the symmetry, then we can just focus on that symmetry at the level of the problem of evil. Because if the symmetry holds there, then if the theist is maintaining that there's too much goodness in the world for there to be an evil God, well, just flip it around, and given the symmetry between the problem of good and the problem of evil, then there's too much evil in the world for there to be a good God. So that's basically how the bracketing move is supposed to work. It works by trying to say that the theist's real reason for rejecting the evil God hypothesis is the amount of goodness in the world.
So another question with regards to like the evil God challenge is, like, is it even like a coherent notion? Like to say that we can have like a all-powerful, all-knowing, always present being that's perfectly evil. So like, what are your thoughts on like if the evil God challenge is even?
Well, could I first say something, Zach, about about the bracketing move and why I don't think it works?
Yeah, no, my apologies. I totally just skipped by that. My apologies. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. So the bracketing move, I think the bracketing move doesn't work, or at least it doesn't work against all theists. And the reason is just that theists are not compelled to reject the evil God hypothesis just because of the amount of goodness in the world. Like, that's not the reason I reject the evil God hypothesis. I actually grant roughly, I mean, we'll get into this later, but I do think there is like an approximate symmetry between the problem of evil and the problem of good, and the theodicies that can be used on both sides. But that's the amount of goodness in the world is not the reason I reject the evil God hypothesis. So put it like this: the bracketing move only works against theists who accept the following two things. Firstly, that they reject they reject the evil God hypothesis because of the amount of goodness. And secondly, and this is important, they also think, these theists also think, that the amount of goodness and the amount of evil in the world is roughly balanced. Because if you think about it, a theist who rejects the evil God hypothesis because of the amount of goodness in the world could still be a theist, maintain theism without any internal inconsistency, as long as they think that there's much more goodness than evil in the world, right? Because in that sense, they still think that there's an asymmetry. So it only works against a very specific type of theist. This move does, that is. Or it's only going to get traction against theists who think that the amount of goodness and evil in the world is sort of balanced, and there's too much goodness in the world for there to be an evil God. Of course, that would commit them to thinking that there's too much evil in the world for a good God. But I actually don't, I suspect, and the Ben Page, who I wrote the paper on this topic that's in Pacific Philosophical Quarterly, we did actually do a kind of straw poll among various kind of philosophers we know who are interested in this topic, to ask them whether they accept both of those things. And actually, we found hardly anyone who accepted those two claims.
That's interesting. else you want to say on the Brackley move before we take coherence of the evil God challenge?
No, I think that's everything to say on that. Yeah. So,
awesome. So what do you think then about like the coherence? Yeah, I was gonna say, sorry, my internet's a little wacky. I apologize, but yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the coherence of the evil God. I mean, like, it's definitely going to be the case that a number of different ways of thinking about the divine attributes is just going to yield the result that an evil God is not a coherent concept. So, I mean, like, classical theists who think that being and goodness are intrinsically related to each other are not, it's, if you have that kind of view, it's just not going to make sense to say that there's a kind of maximal being who is evil, who is sort of the ultimate reality. And as as you've seen in the paper, we talk about a number of other issues for the concept, the conceptual coherence of an evil God, including the way that God is supposed to be related to moral truth. So yeah, I mean, I think I think that the issue of intrinsic coherence is one of the biggest problems for the concept of an evil God.
That's interesting. Another thing you talk about is this idea of like, is evil just like the privation of good? Like that's one view on like the relationship between good and evil. So could you talk like a little bit about like what that is and the potential like implications for the evil God challenge?
Yeah, sure. So let me say, like, I'm somewhat agnostic about the privation theory of evil. So this is what happens when you write co-authored papers. You don't always hold the same views on everything as a co-author. So yeah, I'm a little bit more agnostic on this issue. But so yeah, I can say, in terms of what is the privation theory of evil, the idea is that evil isn't an independently existing reality. Evil is always parasitic on goodness. You can't just have evil on its own without there being some good thing, which evil is a distortion or perversion of, right? So this is a theory that people normally trace back to Augustine of Hippo. So in terms of, so there are people still today in the philosophy literature who will defend this theory of evil. Now, the way that the way that some people used to try to argue for a privation theory of evil was to basically run through like sort of examples of evil things and try to show how it would make sense to think of them as always being a distortion of some good thing, right? So you could say, well, look, you think of war is an evil. Well, war is a privation of peace. It's a state in which peace has been disrupted. So say, well, war is dependent on peace. The evil of betrayal is a privation, or it's a distortion of a trusting relationship. And you just kind of work through examples of good things and evil things, and try and show how they're always fundamentally dependent on good things. I don't really think that's a very good strategy, because it sort of feels a bit too piecemeal. And as we say in the paper, I think the better approach to trying to defend the privation theory is to give a general theoretical account of what goodness is, one which will see evil as being kind of dependent on goodness. So, and the theory that we have in mind is what's sometimes known as an attributive account of goodness. So this is an account of the metaphysical nature of goodness. So on the attributive theory of goodness, you can never say that something just is good, right? It's always a good X, right? So to be good on this theory is to be a well-functioning type of thing. So you can have like a good knife, and a good knife is good because, well, it's fulfilling its function well, the function of what it is to be a knife. You can have a good car, which fulfills its function well of being a car. You can have a good human being, which is a person who fulfills to a high degree the sort of telos or goal of what it is to be human. But there's no such thing as just being good as such, right? So you hopefully get the gist of this theory. And the reason that a privation theory of evil kind of flows from this theory of goodness is that evil is just kind of when something doesn't succeed in fulfilling its function well. So it's badness or evil is just when something is a badly functioning example of that type of thing. Now, as I said earlier, I'm a bit agnostic about this approach, because I do have this intuitive pull to want to say that there is like a distinctively moral kind of goodness that isn't just reducible to whether something is a properly functioning instance of its kind. I mean, a particularly tricky case for privation theorists of evil is to make sense of the badness of pain. So it's, many people find it plausible that pain is intrinsically bad, which is not to say pain can bring about something good, but that would be to say that pain is extrinsically good, and that's fine. You can say like pain is good insofar as it brings about some good outcome, but just in and of itself, pain is a bad thing. Seems quite plausible. But what, does it really make sense to say that what pain is a sort of like deficiency or a failure of something to fulfill its function? And I'm not really sure that, how plausible it is to give an account of pain that's like that. So all that to say, I think that the attributive theory of goodness is the best way to defend the privation theory of evil. And if the privation theory of evil were true, then the evil God hypothesis wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't be coherent, because it would be positing a kind of ontologically ultimate being who is evil, which on this theory is to sort of be a deficient example of something. It is to sort of in some way lack something. Which doesn't seem to kind of work with saying that this being is ontologically ultimate.
So the last thing you talk about, like with regards to like intrinsic coherence, is like the relationship between like moral truth and the evil God challenge. So like relationship between like how God relates to moral truth matter when we're looking at like the challenge.
So yeah, how does this impact the evil God challenge? So yeah, I mean, I think potentially this issue does impact the evil God challenge. The way it impacts it is by suggesting that the evil God hypothesis can only be coherent given certain theories of how God relates to moral goodness or moral truths. Whereas the good God hypothesis is coherent given a much wider range of theories. So it's sort of like saying the evil God hypothesis is sort of, when you look at the landscape of possible accounts of how God relates to moral truths, the evil God sort of gets squeezed in a way that the good God hypothesis doesn't. So its plausibility gets reduced in that way. So yeah, in terms of, and without going into all the details, the general thought is this: like you've got various accounts of how God relates to goodness, and many of them involve claims about goodness being grounded in God's nature or God's commands. And the basic issue is just that if we say that goodness is dependent on God's nature or commands, then the evil God, no matter what the his character traits are, how cruel, how malicious, whatever, the evil God, according to these different theories, will be good, because goodness is dependent upon whatever God's nature is or whatever his commands are. So it just won't be the case that this being is actually an evil God. So there's a kind of conceptual problem there, which you don't have with the good God hypothesis. where goodness is dependent on God's character traits, and so on any hypothesis where God's nature or commands or whatever is the thing that grounds goodness, you don't have an inconsistency problem there. That being is indeed a good God, as the hypothesis claims. Whereas you have this issue with the evil God hypothesis that you don't actually end up getting to call that being evil, because of the dependence of goodness on that being's nature or commands and so on. So all that to say, the only hypothesis, it seems to me, on which an evil God ends up coherent is the one in which the metaphysical nature of moral truth has nothing to do with God, basically.
Yeah, that's very thoughtful. So the next kind of like categories of symmetries is like with regards to natural theology. You talk about like two different kinds of arguments. So the first one is like an ontological argument where we say like, well, it's possible that like a maximally great being exists, and if you exist in all possible worlds, like an ontological argument. But then can you say like the same thing with regards to, like, it's possible that a maximally evil being exists? So I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on the proposed symmetry with regards to ontological arguments in the evil God challenge?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I actually think that a lot of this is going to link back to how we conceive of the metaphysical nature of goodness and perfection, because ontological arguments generally rely on something to do with like the notion of perfection, or a maximal degree of a good making property. So the modal ontological argument, which is sort of the currently most popular version of ontological arguments, basically says that it's possible that necessarily a perfect being exists. And from the possibility, that possibility premise, given certain rules of inference in modal logic, which are quite widely accepted, the very possibility of a necessarily existing perfect being entails the actuality of that perfect being. But so, yeah, of course, that built into that premise is the concept of a perfect being. And so whether you can kind of make this argument work for an all evil being is going to depend crucially on how you understand perfection. Could you have a maximally evil being who was perfect? And as I said, I think given like a lot of traditional ways of thinking about the divine attributes, about these great making properties, that is not going to make any sense to say that you could have a maximally evil being who is a perfect being. This does link in part to like how we construe the metaphysical nature of goodness, and certainly if you have a privation type theory, it's not going to make any sense to think in terms of a maximally evil being a perfect being. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, do you have anything you were going to add something?
Well, I think all that to say. I mean, I think as well. I mean, and this isn't there is quite a lot of literature on the ontological argument now, and there are a number of philosophers who engage with parity arguments, because parity arguments are kind of a long-standing way of trying to respond to the ontological argument. Basically, to say, well, yes, but you can make this argument work just as well for an all-evil being. And I think just to acknowledge, I'm not like as familiar with that literature as with some of the other issues we've touched on. So, but all that to say, I don't. It's not the case that the only arguments for thinking that the ontological argument can't be parodied. It's not the case that all of those responses depend on a privation theory of evil.
Yeah, that's good. Another one of the almost like arguments from consciousness. So like, what's the symmetry going on there they're proposing, and like, how would you kind of respond to that?
Yeah, well, so this one I think is, I'm somewhat more sympathetic to this symmetry than I am to some of the others, because like, I think you so the idea is basically, look, an evil god is roughly as likely to create a world that involves fine-tuning for life and consciousness as a good god is. Now, one thing we say in the paper is that the good god hypothesis has some quite straightforward reasons for saying that the hypothesis predicts that God would be likely to create a world with conscious life involving fine-tuning and so on. And one reason is to do with what's been called the kind of diffusive nature of goodness. So goodness, sort of like by its nature, involves something about kind of wanting to increase and it sort of overflow and expand. And so if that's right, that goodness essentially involves a sort of urge to kind of increase itself, then it sort of does it does make sense why it would be quite likely that God would create fine-tuned conscious life. Now, with the evil God hypothesis, certainly it does seem like there are versions of the evil God hypothesis where the evil God has a psychology that makes him want to the thing he really desires is to torture people, which is of course going to involve consciousness and fine-tuning, I suppose. I think that the point there I just want to make is that it's less clear that just follows from the nature of evil itself. Like, it does seem like a coherent sub-hypothesis of the general evil God hypothesis, but it's not so clear that that's like just it's not clear that that's like the only or even the most likely type of psychology that an evil being would have. And so, because you might think as well, another kind of psychology an evil god might have would be one that makes him just want to be isolated from anything outside of himself, or just have a desire for destruction, which would mean he would just, even if he did kind of create a world, he would just want to destroy it like before anything got going, really. So all that to say, it's not saying that that there are no reasons why an evil god might create a world with consciousness and fine-tuning, but just that it's not clear that the reasons that an evil god might have would be as strong as the reasons a good god might have for creating life.
Yeah, that's good. So then the last section of the paper, and you talk about, like, this is probably the most prominent thing, is like with Theodicies, with like the evil God challenge. So like some proponents will say, like, you see the theists will use all these things to try to reconcile a good God with all the evil in the world, or we can do the same thing with like an evil God and all the good in the world. So what are your thoughts on, like, does the evil God challenge show that Theodicies are like an absurd notion?
Well, the evil God challenge shows that someone who thinks that the reverse Theodicies are absurd should also think that the positive Theodicies are absurd, right? So for a certain subset of theists who think when they look at the reverse Theodicies that the evil God challenges describe, and they think that's ridiculous. Like, God wouldn't. It wouldn't be the case that an evil God would create free will in order to have evils which are freely brought about rather than just brought about by God's direct will. So if someone looks at those reversed Theodicies and thinks they're just ridiculous, that they don't provide any reasons that offset the problem of good, then they should think that the positive Theodicies that theists give to defend against the problem of evil, they should think those are ridiculous and absurd as well. I'm not a theist who thinks that those reversed Theodicies are absurd. Like, I think they do give some genuine reasons that that mitigate the problem of good to some degree. So therefore, I'm not committed to thinking that the positive Theodicies are absurd either. Now, sorry.
No, I was going to move on to the next question. So do you have anything you want to add before we move on?
No, I mean, all that to say, yeah. So like, I do accept that most of the major theistic Theodicies can be reversed. and I don't think the reversals are just absurd or something like that. I don't necessarily think they're all as strong as the original versions, though. But yeah, maybe this will come up in the question you're about to ask.
Yeah, so the question then becomes like, do you think that like the asymmetries, do you think that there are any asymmetries between like the problem of evil and the problem of good?
Yes, I do. So the way that you articulated this in the paper that I've written on this is to say that so think about this. Imagine a world that we can call torture world, in which all of the conscious creatures in that world are experiencing just horrible agony for every moment of their existence. Now compare that with a world that you might call mixed world, where we can kind of choose between various courses of actions, and we suffer in this world, but we also experience good things and pleasure and so on. And so people misuse their freedom and they hurt other people and all of that sort of thing. So now, if I put the question to you, like, which world would you prefer to exist in? I mean, I think it's just really obvious, right? You would prefer to exist in mixed world. So that suggests, very strongly suggests, I would say, that an evil god would have overwhelming reason to prefer to create torture world rather than mixed world if he has a choice between the two, right? I think that's very plausible. Now kind of think of a third world, which we can call bliss world, which is a world where people don't sort of exercise free choice. They just experience pure kind of unmitigated bliss for every moment of their existence. It's just like that, they're all on a beautiful beach, just enjoying the sunshine, and they don't get to choose between different courses of action, and they don't get to do stuff like that, but they do just get to enjoy themselves for all of the time that they exist. Now, if I were to ask you, which world would you rather exist in, bliss world or mixed world? I don't know what you would say. But at least I think this is plausible, but it's not as obvious, right? And this is the key thing. I would suspect that you at least pause to think about that for a bit, because it's not totally obvious which one you would prefer to exist in. And if that's the case, then what that suggests is there is an asymmetry here, because whilst an evil god would have overwhelming reason to create torture world rather than mixed world, like if the evil god's all about causing maximal pain, maximal suffering, of course he should choose the world which is the one we would least like to exist in. On the other hand, the good god doesn't have overwhelming reason to create bliss world instead of mixed world. And so that indicates that there's a significant asymmetry here, because what that means is that the evil god hypothesis predicts a torture world, whereas the good god hypothesis does not, or doesn't nearly as strongly predict a bliss world. It's much more plausible that a good god might create a mixed world than it is that an evil god would create a mixed world.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Maybe someone could say, like, well, maybe a perfectly evil being would maybe want to create a torture world, but wouldn't a perfectly good god want to create like a perfect world with like no suffering at all and not a mixed world? So I'm curious, maybe if you have any thoughts there.
Well, I put it back to the thought experiment. Like, when you think about which world would you rather exist in, a mixed world or a bliss world, I don't know. I'll tell you what in response to that question, I have some uncertainty, and I can see reasons why I might want to exist in a mixed world, at least temporarily. Whereas when I think about a torture world and a mixed world, it's just so obvious I wouldn't want to exist in a torture world. And so insofar as God's reasons for creating have to do with our preferences and the experiences that conscious creatures would have, it seems like, yeah, a mixed world might very well be a world that God would create, at least for a time being. Whereas when you think about an evil God, that it's just very implausible that an evil God would create a mixed world rather than a torture world, which is clearly the world that we would least want to exist in.
Yeah, that's great. So that's all the questions we have. There was one thing that popped up. Oh, wow, I just lost my screen there for a second. There's one thing that popped up because I know you're British, so I don't know if you have an opinion on this, Max, but football opinions on who will win the Super Bowl. I think he's referring to the Champions League final because I saw it's like Man City and Chelsea, and I don't know if you are those people that care or you just have no interest in like English football.
No, I do follow football, or soccer as you guys would call it, very much from a distance. So like, yeah, I mean, I'm aware of the Champions League. Who do I think is going to win? I reckon Man City.
That's probably the safe answer. Do you have a favorite club?
I don't anymore. I used to, when I was growing up, I used to like Liverpool. But okay, I've never been to Liverpool, so I didn't have a good reason to support them. Really. It's just, yeah.
That's fair. Well, Mac, thank you so much for your time. It's been so much fun talking with you about the Evil God Challenge. Do you have any kind of like last thoughts, things you want to say before we wrap things up here?
Oh, thanks, Zach. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think this whole debate around the Evil God Challenge is, I suspect there's a few more rounds to go. And I think, actually, I would say I did, you may have seen this, I did do a discussion with Alex O'Connor on this topic. And I think he raised some objections to the points I made in the paper, particularly around the one that really got me thinking was around the relationship between God and moral truth, which is something I need to give more thought to, because he wanted to say, well, fine, we can't call evil God evil on some of these theories of how God relates to moral truth, but what we could do is reframe the evil God hypothesis as the hypothesis that the good God is cruel, malicious, and so on. And I thought that was a really interesting point, and certainly one that I'm wanting to give more thought to. And I think, I mean, one response, but this might not cut it, I'm not sure, is to say that, well, the relationship between goodness and sort of the character traits of cruelty, the character traits of being loving, being kind, and so on, is a non-contingent one, such that like in no possible world could there be a God who was good and yet had these character traits. So anyway, all that to say, I think there's more that needs to be thought about in that respect. But yeah, I don't think I have any other comments on it at this point.
Yeah, well, it's been great, and I appreciate you joining me. There's a link down below where you can check out the paper. Channel is all for you to subscribe, leave a like, and support on Patreon if somehow you're hearing this, because I think my connection just dropped a lot. But Max, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a lot of fun, so I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Zach. Take care. Bye.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a good one, and God bless.